Greetings. I'm so happy to be with you today. You just saw a short rendition of the traditional raga, Sindhi Bhairavi. My music journey began very early in my childhood with singing. I was almost always singing. Later, I started playing guitar, and as soon as I learned 3 chords, I began making up songs. As a teenager, I played with several rock and roll groups, and by the time I started university, I was composing acoustic guitar solos. At the same time, I felt that I was reaching the limits of what I could achieve on my own. I saw a poster on the campus announcing a concert of Indian music by Ali Akbar Khan and his ensemble. It aroused my curiosity, and I went to the performance. I was fascinated and very moved. I felt as if the maestro could go anywhere with his melodies, but at the same time, his music seemed to have very deep roots. After the concert, he announced that he had recently opened a college in California where anyone could come and study with this music. The following summer, 1972, I traveled to California and began studying at the Ali Akbar College. It was exciting, and I felt very strongly that I had finally found the music style that would give me the perfect balance between a rigorous tradition and the freedom to improvise and compose. Although the instruments were exotic, musically I felt very much at home. Maestro Khan, who we addressed as Khansab, taught us in the traditional method of oral tradition. He would sing or play a phrase, and we had to pick it up by listening and then repeat it. That summer, I also had my first Indian rhythm lessons with the then very young maestro, Ustad Zakir Hussain. I couldn't have imagined that 15 years later, I would have the honor of performing with Zakir ji in concerts and recordings in the US, Europe, and India. Khansab's classroom was a mixture of traditional Indian teaching techniques and innovation. Some of the compositions that he taught us had been composed by his father and his father's teachers, and many he simply composed on the spot. Thus, we learned not only the musical phrases, but also how he was composing. It was the most extraordinary way of learning music that I have ever experienced. And as soon as we understood one line, he would go on to the next. This went on for 37 years, until he passed away at the age of 87. And now, 50 years later, I feel that I'm still learning with him every day. I am forever grateful for all the support and guidance that I received from Ustad Ali Akbar Khan and tabla maestro Pandit Swapan Chaudhary. Khansab was like a second father to me, and Swapanda was like an elder brother. In 1985, we opened the Ali Akbar College of Music in Switzerland, and this institute is now one of the important centers for studying Indian music outside of India. A few years later, Khansab invited me to perform with him. Before the first time, in Amsterdam, he asked Swapanda, "Do you think Ken is ready to perform with me?" Swapanda replied, Who will ever be ready to perform with you, Kansab? Of course, he is as ready as anyone could be. Give him a chance. When the concert began, Kansab introduced me, telling the audience how it was part of the Indian tradition for a guru to bring the disciple onto the stage to assist him. Then he said, "This is Ken's first time playing with me. I'm sure you can understand how he feels, so please give him your support." There was a big applause, and we began. My attention was completely focused on Kansab. There hadn't been any rehearsals. My entire training with him had been the rehearsal for this. I was doing pretty well. And then, during the last section, when the intensity and the speed were increasing to a climax, suddenly one of Kansab's strings broke. There was an audible gasp in the audience. Kansab turned to me, smiled, and nodded for me to continue. I took a deep breath and went on playing at this high speed for 5 long minutes, and when his string was repaired, he began playing again, with the audience roaring in applause. It seemed I had passed the test. After the concert, he said to me, "Very good. You see, it's easy." However, even with all the love and guidance, sometimes it was not easy with the guru. As we became closer, Kansab's expectations of me grew, and if I slipped up in any way, he didn't hesitate to give me a verbal beating. Even if I thought I was doing what he requested, he would say, "It doesn't matter what I say. You have to know what I want." This was an entirely different kind of lesson, but just as important as the ragas and rhythms. This year, 2022, we celebrate the 100th centenary year of Ustad Ali Akbar Khan, one of the greatest musicians in the history of Indian music. My interest in the traditions of Western classical music also grew, and I transitioned from the guitar to the medieval lute, a pear-shaped plucked instrument. I was immediately struck by the similarities between European medieval music and Indian music, and during the next 40 years, as a professor at the Music Conservatory of Basel, Switzerland, I was able to develop a pedagogy for teaching improvisation techniques to Western music students using many of the traditional practices that I had learned from Indian music. In addition to the music itself, some of the important teaching tools that Maestro Khan used in the classroom were figures of speech, like metaphors and analogies. For him, music had a connection with many aspects of life, and it was enlightening for us to see his grand view of music beyond the notes and rhythms. Sometimes he would use the analogy of an architect, building up a raga from the foundation to the first and then upper floors. Then he would critique our improvisations. "What are you doing? Trying to build the second floor before the first floor is complete? Your house will fall down." Other times, he would create a beautiful image. "You have to show the microtones of this note like the soft undulations of the water on a peaceful lake, in constant but subtle motion." During the long years of study, I sometimes had doubts and difficulties. Very few of my friends and family were encouraging me to devote myself to Indian music, and even some thought it was not a serious pursuit and questioned how a Westerner like me would ever be able to earn a living playing Indian music. But I remember early on in my studies, one evening, watching the sunset on a hillside and wondering whether I should even continue learning the Cirode, a voice came from inside and said, "Go for it, or you will never forgive yourself for not trying." That gave me courage, and I needed it. Even after a number of years of performing and getting very good reviews from both listeners and the press, I experienced some discrimination, as there was skepticism about whether a non-Indian could or even should perform Indian music. This was very hurtful and frustrating for me. But then, one of India's leading music critics, Mohan Nadkarni, assured me, "Ken, don't worry about this. The real Indian music connoisseurs listen with their ears open and their eyes closed." For most of my life, I was very happy to be a player of music and let the craftsmen take care of my instruments. But there came a time when I felt the need to get more involved in innovations and inventions to improve the Indian traditional instruments. In so doing, I realized that sometimes necessity is the mother of invention. When I first began concertizing in India, usually the organizer would provide both a tanpura and someone to play it. But after several years, it became more and more difficult to arrange this. Finally, I was shocked when before a concert, I asked for the tanpura and the organizer brought out an electronic box that spewed a horrible digital imitation of a tanpura. These gadgets were becoming more and more popular in India, and I just couldn't understand how musicians could substitute the exquisite and rich sound of a real tanpura with this electronic noise. I had to do something about this. With only 5 strings that needed to be plucked in the same order, same intensity, same rhythm, why couldn't there be a mechanical device that could play the tanpura? So I started to imagine how this could be done, and one morning I opened my hand, suspended it over the tanpura, and imagined a disc rotating slowly above the strings, with plectrums attached to it, each one plucking the strings of the tanpura as the disc rotated. When I presented this idea to a friend, who is an expert in repairing Indian instruments, he said, "Ken, I think you're off your rocker. It definitely won't work, and if it does, I'll eat my hat." Undaunted, I went to a Swiss craftsman who was fascinated by new challenges, and he thought it could be done. It took time to engineer and build, and there were numerous technical challenges, but we were thrilled when finally it was successful. I decided to call it Shanti because it made me feel peaceful watching and listening to it. In the end, it is an excellent example of the blending of Indian tradition, Swiss craftsmanship, and American ingenuity. Would you like to see Shanti in action? I had another instrument problem. My new Cirode was so loud and brash sounding that I sometimes had to use earplugs just to prevent getting a headache. I had to find a solution and became immersed in the fascinating world of acoustics, instrument woods, and design. Luckily, the brass resonator that most Cirodes are equipped with is simply attached to the Cirode like a light bulb to a socket. It can be easily unscrewed. Once I removed it, I wondered, couldn't I just make a better sounding resonator out of wood? I began trying different woods, first alone and then in combinations. Each one produced a different tone quality. I also began to think about speaker cabinets, which are sometimes made of 3 different size speakers, each one responsible for a specific range of frequencies, like bass, mid-range, and treble. We combined the woods so that each one of these ranges would be amplified, and even added a bronze horn-shaped tweeter, which added brilliance to the higher frequencies. Then we wanted to increase the size of the resonator for more volume. But if it got too big, I saw that it would block my left hand from playing some of the notes on the fingerboard. So I decided, instead of putting the hole on the back of the resonator, like the others, we could put the hole on the side, in a scallop shape that would allow the left hand full access to the notes. It worked, and now sounds amazing. I continue to be fascinated by the many sources of inspiration that enable rigorous improvisation and creativity in music. In addition to the necessity of many years of learning and practice, these include developing instincts for imagination, free association, creating analogies and metaphors, and being motivated both to take risks and welcome accidents, which sometimes produce the sparks for new inspirations and discoveries. I have also been inspired by the ideas of legendary maestros, scientists, and composers. For example, Ustad Ali Akbar Khan on the rigorous nature of every second in Indian music performance. He says, "When you play music, Every second is so important that you can't think about anything else. If you miss half a second, then you are missing so many things. The tone quality, the pitch, the feeling, the raga, the rhythm, and then the quarter beat. Therefore, you must keep the mind very, very aloof. Other things, you can talk on the telephone and write something else, or you are cooking and talking on the telephone. In music, you can't do that. The famous Western composer, Igor Stravinsky, on freedom versus rigorous creativity. My freedom consists in moving about within the narrow frame that I have assigned myself for each one of my undertakings. My freedom will be so much the greater and more meaningful the more narrowly I limit my field of action and the more I surround myself with obstacles. Whatever diminishes constraint diminishes strength. The more constraints one imposes, the more one frees oneself of the chains that shackles the spirit. Albert Einstein, on imagination. Imagination is the highest form of research. Imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited. Imagination circles the world. Finally, I am always inspired by a quote from the highly revered Swami Vivekananda. Music is the highest art, and to those who understand, is the highest worship. Thank you very much. I hope this presentation has given you some food for thought, or better yet, food for imagination.